Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the difference between politicians that were standing for public office, political office in 1970 and compare it to today. And the difference is stark, and I'd like to go through some of those differences. But looking at this is the classic sort of 1970 TV advert. This is pre-internet, of course. So if candidates wanted to get their political message out, it had to be using things like TV and radio and so on, newspapers and the like. So I looked at a candidate from 1970, a man, he'd be in his 50s. He'd already accomplished things in his life, accomplished things in his own right, and he decided he wanted to stand for political office. So he wasn't just some political hack or something like that. He was a guy who'd contributed, built, and created something for his country, or served in the military, for example. Anyway, this guy was and he seemed pretty typical of the people, many, not all, but many of the people serving in or wanting to serve in say a state or the federal U.S. legislature, federal Congress, and the thing was very policy based. So the pitch was very policy based. I believe in this, and I'm going to do that. I will support the following, and we need more roads, or we need better administration. We don't want to waste taxpayer dollars. We need more police on the streets. We need tax incentives for people to open up businesses, this sort of thing. Everything was pitched at the common good. I represent all the people in the electoral district, and what I'm doing to the common good. I'm not into chasing sectional minority grievance interests. And bear in mind, at the time, the population of America was 91% white. So it wasn't like there were minority interests to be concerned about in the same way, at least in the same scale that there is today. But anyway, it was very if you give me the responsibility of being in government, then I will make decisions and have support policies that are for everyone's benefit. Now, would everyone benefit equally? That we could argue and say, well, if you've got incentives for people to open up businesses, how will that help black people, given it's merit-based? If you want to increase the quality of education and raise the bar, then how will that help people who aren't bright and hardworking? So the idea that producing equal outcomes was still a long way into the future. Not that there weren't people that were already talking about and trying to get cut through on that, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The United Nations at the time was, leaning left, I guess, but it hadn't become a Marxist, feminist, lesbian playground at that point. It was still something that was trying to do good work around the world, alleviate poverty in areas, have refugee camps in areas where there was, say, civil war and things like that. And they perceived that to be their focus. The idea of pushing international black lesbian issues was not something that at the time was on their radar, or I'm sure there are people in there that were angling towards that. Now, there were politicians in America that wanted to do the grievance politics thing, and they were more from the Democrat side. And, the Kennedys, for example, Robert Kennedy was an example, would go and find some dirt poor black neighborhood out in the middle of fucking nowhere and say, look how these people are living. Look, this is terrible. It's outrage. What an outrage. Just look at their poverty. We have to do something. We are the richest country in the world. We have to do something about this. Grievance, outrage and grievance. So even back then, there were, in that, I think 67, 68, somewhere around there, we can afford to fight a war in Vietnam. We can afford to do something about these people. So the idea of creating an artificial grievance, a problem that actually doesn't exist, but pretending it is a problem, and then say the only way to solve the problem is to produce equal outcomes. And the only way to do that is to throw tax dollars and have everyone else sort of treading on eggshells. And so it came to a situation where if there's a company of 1,000 people, all they have to do is insert one black lesbian to that company, and the other 999 people all have to tiptoe around that one because it's equity and it's equality and so on. But the embryonic sort of outrage grievance industry was already there, and you could see it being ginned up by particularly the Jewish activists, but ginned up by the Allen Ginsbergs and so on of the day, and they managed to rope in big names, like John Lennon to write songs for them and act as a mouthpiece, which I think he figured they'd suckered him in for that, as he started to get a little bit older and maybe somewhat wiser. But compare that 1970 politician, compare it to today. Well, firstly, they were mostly nearly all men back then, but nonetheless, just looking at if you look at like AOC and Ilhan Omar and Ayanna Presley and Rashida Tlaib and various other local candidates, like state candidates and so on, and they go online to do their and they talk like whiny schoolgirls. They seem to have the mentality of a 15-year-old, and they talk in this whiny voice. They're totally and exclusively committed to addressing minority grievance interests, not on the basis of helping them uplift, but helping them achieve equal outcomes through pulling down the evil straight white Nazi. And in every case, they're very anti-white, they're very anti-Christian, very anti-male. And constantly reminding the rest of us how evil and bad we are and how outrageous it is that black lesbian single mothers aren't the richest people in America and so on and so forth. But there's no talk about increasing productivity, increasing wealth. And there's no talk about the things that are going to help everybody, that will benefit everybody. Even if someone wants to be on welfare, if there are more taxes being collected, more wealth to go around, then there's more welfare to go around, things like that. But trying to create equal outcomes is, of course, always a fool's errand, and then trying to do it off the back of invented, manufactured grievance interests. Do you know that transgender people are murdered at 10 million times the rate? 100 billion transgender people are murdered every second. And then ginning up this ridiculous and fake outrage. Now, also, there's a big difference in 1970 that if a politician, tried to peddle absolute nonsense, the journalists and the anchors and the interviewers were committed to, at that stage, accurate information. And it wasn't perfect, by the way, but and they were quite soft on some of the Kennedys, claiming outrage for black people and how the Kennedys were going to help and all this sort of thing. But the pushback was always there, and if a politician started to peddle nonsense about a million transgender people that are murdered every second, then they'd get immediate pushback from the journalists and so on. Well, how do you verify? Where did you get information from? How can you prove it? How? And who said that? And so the journalists and the interviewers really make a chase on it, and they'd even push back. Well, that's nonsense. That's absurd. Why are you telling these lies? Whereas today they don't. So someone like AOC can get up and say, well, straight white male Christians murder 10 billion people every nanosecond. Yeah, outrage. And the journalists will and the anchors will very rarely push back on that. They'll just nod and go along. And I was watching some Indian propagandist running around saying that the population of India was murdered 50 million times over or something by the British. No, there wasn't. Indian famines have been a thing since day one. And then you run around saying suddenly famines began only when the white man turned up. You're kidding me, right? And yet the interviewer just doesn't push back. So we've also got a very different media here, which will allow this manufactured outrage stuff to permeate all levels of conversation, which of course affects the public discourse and shifts the Overton window in various directions that it shouldn't be on. If merit, truth, and accuracy were still holding centre stage, then do you think an Ilhan or an AOC would ever get elected to anything? They're only there because of the degradation of the and the mass migration. They're only there because of the degradation of fact, truth, and accuracy. And someone can say whatever they want, I mean, as long as it's accurate. But this idea of pursuing outrage, inventing outrage, and pursuing niche interest politics of equal outcomes, that's devastating the West. The West was, and I noticed this when I first started business traveling, the West was the only part of the world where merit played the primary, not the exclusive, but the primary role in economic functioning and wealth creation. In other parts of the world, it played almost no role. And in where merit played the least role were the most impoverished areas of the world, which is hardly a surprise. Where merit played the bigger role, then were the richest areas of the world. Again, hardly a surprise. So we've lost that now. But again, comparing the childlike simplicity and silliness and absurdity of a politician standing for office today in the West compared to the very, very sober, very focused, very grounded sort of people that were around in 1970. Does that mean that every single politician was perfect in 1970? Of course not. Did it mean that or every issue and every political discussion was based and sensible and real and factual? No. But it was far more so back then than it is today. And today, the quality of people standing for public office is unbelievable. I recently bumped into someone who'd been one of the most senior politicians in government, and she was. It's hard to describe just how unimpressive this person was, and yet they'd been, in political terms, one of the most influential people in Australia. Now, I understand now that the big decisions, political decisions, are made by the globalist cabal, and the local politicians are really just, they're left with a little bit of the window dressing. How many black lesbian painting classes they open up. They're left with that sort of level of decision. The big decisions are all made by the globalists across the West anyway. Which is why Trump annoys them so much, because he wants to make some of those big decisions that they see today as their complete prerogative. Now, because power has shifted away from the elected representatives and moved to the international cabal, they don't care if silly little girls are elected to public office. It doesn't make any difference. The globalists are still in control. And if they window dress it with silly little schoolgirl idiots, then they don't care. They don't give a shit. And I think that's where we are now. So when you look at the 1970, you're talking to people who actually did make the decisions back then. Whereas today, the AOCs can run around coming out nonsense, but they don't make any of the decisions, and nor do any of the political class anymore. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.